BC.
Thank you, Vivian. Hi, friends. My name's Trish, and I'm an alcoholic. I am beyond grateful to be here today with you. I'm beyond grateful to be sober. I got to say that right off the top. I actually, I wake up every morning going, I'm still sober. I didn't drink yesterday. You're kidding, right? I mean, left to my own devices, that's what I would do. It's just absolutely true. I know this isn't the Academy Awards, but I really have a bunch of people to thank, and I don't want to forget it. Okay. So I want to thank the ORC committee and, the incredible work that goes on to putting an event of this nature and size. It's an amazing job, and all of the volunteers and the core committee and all those folks, you have my undying admiration. And among those folks, I'd really like to thank Lisa, the chair, and especially Deborah, the program chair, who was so kind and gentle and loving in terms of her communications with me and made me feel so welcome and made sure that I had all the information I needed. And that just means a whole lot. I'd also like to thank my amazing host, Kathy N., who's in the second row here, who met me at the airport and has been just a joy to get to know even just a little. And I want to I have a couple of friends. I came in a couple of days early, and I stayed with some friends. And I want to thank David G., and I want to thank Kathy B. Kathy B. and I worked together in Vancouver, and Kathy and David are married. Kathy she's an extraordinary friend. She's also the first person to tell me that maybe I had a problem with alcohol many years ago. She's brave. But it's a testimony to the programs of Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon family groups that we're friends today. And I also I want to thank the members of the Sunnyside group in Toronto, because I went to your group. Thank you for keeping the lights on in your home group. Thank you for having a great home group, and thank you for making me feel so welcome there. Some of you may recognize me. I actually, about a year ago, there was this whole spate of speaking. So I think there are some of you in the room who could probably stand here and tell my story for me. So if any volunteers, perfectly welcome. But, I want to thank Sarasa, the East Central Region of Assembly of Alcoholics Anonymous, or anyway, you know what I mean. The Eastern Canada Regional Forum and the Area 83 Spring Assembly. I know people from all of those events, so even though I'm thousands of kilometers away from home, I feel so much at home. As mentioned, my current home group is Crescent Heights, and I want to let you know my sobriety date. The reason I'm so surprised I get up in the morning and I'm still sober, it still shocks me. My sobriety date is February 19th, 1993. So I fairly recently, celebrated one of those anniversaries that has a 0 attached to it. And thank you. And no one, I really, it's one day at a time for anyone who's new. And I also, in my Academy Awards, I forgot to thank the wonderful speakers that I've heard, that I've been able to hear since the program started, right? And the great messages that I've heard. It's just astonishing. But if you're new and you're seeing people up here and we're saying we have, like last night, 36 years, and Katie, her years, and then 30, it's one day at a time. That's how we get this new freedom. It's one day at a time. But the astonishing thing is that those 1 days at a time all kind of line up just like a bunch of pearls on a necklace. And before you know it, you wake up in the morning and go, really? 30 years? Holy. And it's not a testament to me. It's a testament to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I love the theme. I love a new freedom. And for me, there's something attached to that. Because a new freedom comes with responsibility. Freedom is something that is worked for. Freedom is something that's worked on. Freedom is something that, when Katie was talking about her father, my dad's also a World War II vet, and they talked about freedom, and they talked about the responsibility they had to freedom. And when I hear about freedom in Alcoholics Anonymous, I have a responsibility to Alcoholics Anonymous. I have a responsibility to thousands of people that I will never meet, who will never know the impact of their service to Alcoholics Anonymous on my sobriety. And I owe that right? And I need to keep that going. So home groups are really important to me. When I got serious about getting sober, my first home group for 29 years, I don't like change. My home group for 29 years, what are the two things alcoholics hate the most? The first is change, the second is the way things are. My first home group was the Reflections group of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm going to talk a bit about that because to me, the home group is the heartbeat of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's where I get to know you and you get to know me, and I get to learn what it's like to be responsible so I can work towards that new freedom. And it's where I learn all these things, and it's where to me it's just that DNA. So when I got serious about getting sober, I'll talk a bit more about that. I joined the Reflections group, which met in East Vancouver. It was a resentment and a coffee pot group. It grew out of a fellowship center in Burnaby, and a couple of people got a little choked about how things were going, so they started this other group, Reflections. And they were reading from Reflections, but in true Alcoholics Anonymous fashion, it was named Reflections for all those 29 years. We didn't read from Reflections, we read from As Bill Sees It, go figure. But it met in the Legion 135, at the corner of Nanaimo and Hastings in East Vancouver. And it was one of those really grotty, crummy old Legions, right? And it was perfect for a drunk like me. You walked in, and the beer hall, the bar was on the right, but the smell of stale beer would just come wafting over you as you walked in the door. And to get to our meeting, you walked up these really rickety stairs into a fairly big room. And it was a small group, but a fairly big room. And at the far end of the room, there was a portrait of Queen Elizabeth. And the thing is that, it had been there for so long. And of course, rest her soul, but the glass was yellow with nicotine from the smoke from downstairs. So poor Liz looked like she had jaundice, right? And there were holes in the floor, so you could actually stand there and you could look over and you could see what you were missing, right? Oh yeah, look at that, right? And there were people who were shocked that we would have a meeting in a bar, right? But it says in our book, we for right purposes we can go anywhere as sober members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was a great group. Now one day we got to our meeting room. At our meeting, right, look at rickety stairs and all, and there was a chain, the place was shut down, and the Legion had closed down very, very suddenly, and someone from the Legion had run away with the Legion's money. So it doesn't just happen in Alcoholics Anonymous, right? No, Legion ran away with the Legion's money, and we were at sea. We didn't quite know what to do, so it was difficult even in those days to try and find meeting spaces. And we hunted around, we sort of tagged onto other meetings. It wasn't working very well. We were afraid we'd just have to close the group. And then I lived in the neighborhood because for this alcoholic, having a home group that I can walk to, I'm blessed, and I'll talk more about that later, but having a home group that I can walk to means my chances of missing my home group are slim to nil. Right? I have no excuse. It doesn't matter about the weather. It doesn't matter about the transit. I can walk to my home group. So I lived fairly close to my home group, and this postcard came through my mail slot one day, and it was advertising a new funeral home called Glenhaven. And Glenhaven actually was an established funeral home in the heart of the downtown east side of Vancouver. And for those of you who know Vancouver, you know that, and every city has one, we're no different than anyone else, but that's the heart of Skid Row. That's the heart of what we call the war zone in Vancouver. It's the heart of where we end up if we continue to drink. It is a place of deep tragedy and sorrow. And Glenhaven had been in the downtown east side for 50 years at that point. It was a small little facility. They built up this brand new facility a few blocks out of the actual core of the downtown east side, opened up this beautiful new facility, and that's what they sent this postcard for. And they were advertising their wares, so to speak. And at the very bottom, it said in little print, meeting rooms available. Well, I called another member of our home group and made an appointment to go and see these folks, and we got in our best bib and tucker, and away we went. And they were delighted to think that there could be a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous in their facility. They were truly delighted to think that they could be part of the solution rather than a part of the end result of the disease of alcoholism. That they could be part of a vibrant and happy group of Alcoholics Anonymous as opposed to a lone coffin with nobody there. Right, because Glenhaven was the funeral home contracted by the city of Vancouver for folks who died and were not claimed. And most of those folks were me if I had kept drinking. So they were so delighted. And, we were Thursday nights at 7:30, and Al-Anon group came on Wednesday nights, and it was great. But, there was a tradition being bent, and Kathleen read the traditions. And whenever there's a problem in a group or an area or a district or anything else, there is likely a tradition which is being a little bit bent or maybe a little bit twisted or even broken. And in our case, there was a tradition, seventh tradition was being just a little bit twisted, and we were aware of it. But when we rented from Glenhaven, they were smart enough not to give us a key. It was a beautiful facility. But they had to have staff on, and they were a 24/7 facility anyway in some cases. And if they had a family in, then they would have staff anyway. But a lot of times they didn't. So that meant they were paying to have staff while we were there. They only charged us $10 a meeting because they felt that they were being paid in more than money. They were being paid by community involvement and things like that. And that was great for as long as that management was in place. Then they got bought. And so the bigger corporation went bottom line, right? Bottom line is like, what is this? This is so punt. We were given 2 weeks notice. And we were just devastated that we had to move from Glenhaven at that point. It was gorgeous, right? I mean, it was really stunning. The joke around town was when we moved there, it's the meeting that everyone's dying to go to, But funeral homes they're really swanky. It was way too posh for us. It was like mahogany tables, a brand new kitchen. Had a smoking balcony because smoking in those days. Had a view of downtown Vancouver. I mean, it was everything, all that in a bag of chips. And then they moved us downstairs, and I was choked. I thought they moved us downstairs into a smaller room. How dare they? We were missing our view and all that stuff. I'm such a good alcoholic, but people, again, it was a very posh room. And the great thing about that room was, the meeting room was dead ahead. You went downstairs instead of upstairs. The meeting room was dead ahead. If you turned left too soon, it was the coffin display room. So, again, I think there's a logic in terms of people moving from a legion to a funeral home. That was going to be my alcoholic journey for sure, right? But we had to leave Glenhaven, and so we went to a church where we were in the prayer room, and I think there's some logic there too. And then during COVID, we stayed online, and we did well online, actually. We were serving a 12-step function, and we had lots of newcomers, and the group stayed together. And as we came out of COVID, the group remained hybrid, which was really great for me because I moved from, mid-COVID, I moved from Vancouver to a smaller community called White Rock, just outside of Vancouver, about 40 minutes outside of Vancouver, depending on traffic. But that meant that I could hang on to my Vancouver home group, right? And you've heard me say I need to be able to walk to my home group. You can't walk from White Rock to Vancouver. But, as we had a tough time coming out of COVID, and I think Alcoholics Anonymous has had a tough time coming out of the pandemic. I think we're still a bit on shifting sands and trying to figure out where we are in this changed world and what's different and what's still evolving and where we're going with it. And that's okay. That's okay, right? The program of Alcoholics Anonymous does not change. But Alcoholics Anonymous changes every time a new person walks in the room. We're a river, a constantly refreshing river, right? And so, it's an extraordinary thing because we have this fabulous central, philosophy and way of living. And then this fabulous fellowship that revolves around it. And, our spiritual principle of rotation and leadership and trusted servants and all that stuff makes for an incredibly dynamic organization. But so as the pandemic started coming out of the pandemic, Reflections was having a rough time. We had, some members had sort of gone by the by. It was difficult for some of the people to be able to show up at the live location and be able to do the setup and all that kind of thing, as if it's for health reasons and things like that. Another group had started up not far from us, and it was attracting a whole bunch of people, which is great. So we looked at it and we thought, okay, what do we do? So we actually changed locations, and you know what? We ended up in another Legion. A better Legion. It was a nicer bar. And so we were at this other Legion, and we gave it 3 months, and if we needed to see if we could sustain it, there was a service deficit. And I was driving in from White Rock, and that's okay when it's light outside, but these are aging eyes, and it's a dark highway. And I need to grow where I'm planted. I need to have my toes in where I am in terms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I need to be of service in the community that I can see. And I love the fact that we have so much more flexibility now with with a pretty wholehearted acceptance of using platforms, of using teleconference platforms. And I'll talk more about that. I'm a firm fan of Zoom. But nonetheless, it was creating some difficulties. So we made the difficult decision to pull the plug on the meeting. And, but all groups have a life, right? And we really needed to look at, were we serving our 12-step purpose? A group, as opposed to a meeting, has a life outside of its meeting time, right? That's the definition of a group. And we had been doing our best, but we just got too small. And so, in the ebb and flow of Alcoholics Anonymous, that's what happened. And I was, of course, devastated. There I am, I'm 29 years sober. I've just lost my home group. I've moved to a community I don't know. I haven't really had a chance to know that community. And so I feel like a newcomer all over again. And that's okay, but it's just, it really is that sort of full circle. I want to let you know, because when the theme of new freedom, we have a freedom, and that new freedom comes from the promises. Now, those promises are after step 9. Let's not forget that, right? A woman read me the promises at the very first AA meeting I ever went to, and I just thought she was from another planet. They made no sense to me whatsoever, which makes sense to me now because I had nothing to replace alcoholic thinking. They just don't make sense until you've had the opportunity to go through the steps with another member of Alcoholics Anonymous, or in a step group, or in a big book study, or however you do it. But they just didn't make sense to this alcoholic at that point. But that new freedom and that responsibility, I like to bring my grandmother with me when I share. And this is my father's mother, and she was from Grand Falls, Newfoundland. I'm a military brat. My father was Navy, my uncle was Army, my aunts were Air Force, my paternal grandfather was RCMP, and so we moved all the time. I was born in Kingston. I lived there for 2 weeks, right? And we moved from coast to coast to coast to coast, and then in a couple of places in Ontario, but we just were moving all the time. So I didn't really know my grandparents or my cousins, and I have no brothers or sisters, okay? But so my father's mom, my grandmother, when we talk about a new freedom, and when I talk about the fact that I like to go to a meeting that I can walk to, my grandmother was the first identifiable alcoholic in our family. And, she was raising a family of 4 in Halifax and struggling with this disease when there was no solution. She was struggling with it before there was Alcoholics Anonymous. And I can't imagine what it must have been like to try and raise a family, to try and just get through one day at a time, and be an alcoholic like me, and be a woman in the 20s in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So she tried to sober up through the Oxford groups. So when I hear our AA history, it's really personal to me. It's really personal. It didn't work for her. The Oxford groups was not a solution for her. And so, when I think about that new freedom that I have, it's a hard-won freedom, right? It's all those women who came before me for whom there were no solutions. I do believe that, I was born an alcoholic. I had every ism going. I believe in the genetic predisposition. I had an only child, self-centered in the extreme. Just, I far preferred the company of adults to kids. I didn't play well with others. We moved all the time. I kept you as far away from me as I could, because don't make friends, Trish. Do not make friends, because you just have to say goodbye to them. And that was how I lived, right? And, the only time I ever, self-centered to the core, the only time I ever really wanted a brother or a sister was every time I had to walk up the steps of a new school. Because I didn't know if they were going to put me a grade ahead or a grade behind, or whether it was going to be new math or whether it was going to be old math. I had no idea what curriculum was going to be thrown at me. And I was really proud of my brains, right? I figured my brains were going to get me through anything. And I loved books because I could find friends in books. I didn't have to physically make friends. I had friends in books. And so, I had a ridiculous vocabulary at a very young age. I've lost it all, I swear. It's all gone. But, it was all of those isms. It was feeling apart from. It was feeling less than. It was not knowing my place. It was all that stuff. And, my father, as we moved across the country, I adored my father, right? But, he was a man of a certain generation. Like I said, he was a World War II vet. He had not a clue what to do with kids. And in our family, again, in terms of identifiable, he was, in hindsight, the identifiable alcoholic, right? He's in our book. He's classically in our book, as am I. But, the family code, the code that my mother and I would use was, well, your dad's a little owly right now. Well, what that meant was it was time for his gin and tonic, and it better be ready, and it better be now. But he was a high-functioning alcoholic, and, it just seemed normal to me, but I adored him, and I wanted his attention, and I spent a lot of time trying to get his attention. And, when he finally left the Navy, he retired at a fairly young age. He had to retire at a certain retirement age, but, he had a whole career ahead of him. And so he joined the Ontario Civil Servants as a marine historian, and we ended up moving to Midland, Ontario. This was a shock. This was a shock to me. I didn't know towns. I knew cities, right? And I didn't know, I've explained to you, I didn't know my family at all. So here I am, I'm in Midland. Everybody's gone to school with everybody else since kindergarten, right? I didn't know how to work my way in there. And they're living across the street from their grandparents, and they know who their cousins are. I didn't really even know who mine were. I still don't. And so fitting in became a real issue again. Right, and I just didn't know how to do it. So I kind of let my brains do it, and I was a horrible child. You would have hated me as a kid, really. Like, honestly, I was precocious, but I was also, it's kind of like in my day, in some of the schools I went to, there would be school prefects who were the people who, made sure you lined up outside the hall and told you what to do, and, people with control issues like me, right? It was a perfect job for this little alcoholic in the making. But it doesn't win you friends by any extent. But, that was okay because I was trying to keep you like this. But obviously we were going to be in Midland for more than like 6 months or a year or 2 years, which was my normal time frame. So, I was just having trouble figuring out. But then there was a boy, right? And so this boy asked me out on a date, and he was my first date, and he was my first lay, and he was my first love, and he was my first marriage, and he was my first ex-husband. Hereunto referred to as George the First. And so George was actually the ticket out of my parents' home, is what it boils down to. The other thing about George, and I want to say here really clearly, I am an alcoholic. I am so grateful that, I tried every other drug known to personkind. None of them stuck. Alcohol was my solution. It really was. One of the things about George, though, he was a bad boy, right? And I fell for the bad boy. Big surprise there, right? The honor roll student, right? I fell for the bad boy. And he was also at the time, the town dope dealer. So, it was great. My parents were really pleased, let me tell you. Yeah, let me tell you. But I left home because to be with George I, and I ran away. I ran away to Mississauga. Woo! Ran away to Mississauga, lived with George I, did grade 13 because you went to grade 13 in those days. Again, was determined. I'm really grateful because I did, before my chronic alcoholism, before the alcohol actually hit my body, I managed to get my education in. And that's the grace of God. That's nothing to do with me. But, so I went to grade 13 in Mississauga, TL Kennedy, for anybody who's wondering. I had arrived, quite frankly. Like, who else did you know in grade 13 who had their own apartment with a dope dealer? But, the whole, it became increasingly obvious to me that perhaps I was a little hasty. George and I got married, and I thought perhaps I was being a little hasty because that part of life got a little crazy and complicated. But, I went on and I stayed in Toronto. I went to university. I went to York, and I worked in Toronto for a year. But, when I got married and when things settled down, one of the magic things happened, and that was that I would drink with my father. That father that I tried to get his attention so much. I'd drink with him, and I had arrived, right? And so I felt like a grown-up. I felt that I had his attention. I felt that we had a relationship. And, it says in those same promises where we get the new freedom, we don't regret the past, and I don't, but it doesn't escape me the irony of the relationship based on spirit, just like Jung would say, on spirits rather than on spirit. But I had that relationship. So George and I actually split up, and my parents, as they said, it was a university gift, but I think it was a gift for dumping George. They gave me a trip to Vancouver to meet my grandmother, this grandmother that I talked about from Grand Falls, Newfoundland. And so I spent 10 days with her and with my aunt, my father's sister. And it was extraordinary. Like, she smoked Cravenet cigarettes, and she drank really horrible tea. And, the kind of tea that she just kept adding tea bags to a pot all day, right? And water, just more tea bags, spoon stands up in it. And so I matched her smoke for smoke and cup of tea for cup of tea. And she told these amazing stories, and she told them in a language that was just revelatory to me. I'd never heard anyone speak like this. I never heard them speak that way, right? She was just so warm, and she was funny, right? And she dragged all these skeletons out of the closet, and it was just amazing. And what I didn't know then that became significant, very significant later on, was that when I met my grandmother, that grandmother who really struggled with the disease of alcoholism, she had been a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous for 7 years. Wow. She was 71. And, and again, the solution was always right in front of me, and I just didn't see it, right? And so, I had this great visit with my grandmother and with my aunt, and I decided I was going to move to Vancouver, and I did. And, I got a great job in my field, and, life was happening. That's where I met Kathy. And then my drinking started to change, right? I started to change my drinking to make sure that I could drink the way I wanted to drink. So, it soon became apparent to me that I drank more than a lot of people. So if there were a work function involving booze, and there often was, I learned that I couldn't drink as much as I wanted to. So I'd have a glass of wine or two to be cool. And then I'd have the after party at my place where I could drink my face off and invite all my lower companions to come and join me. And that's the sneakiness of the disease of alcoholism, right? It snuck in and it started to take over, and I didn't see it, right? I just didn't see it. It was just, I was doing fine, and I was cool, and I also met the man who became my second husband, and here on to referred to as Paul II, second ex-husband. And, I had this incredibly romantic vision of what love was, and that was really what it boiled down to. And, my alcoholism, the effect of it was felt mainly by Paul, right? But we never talked about it. We never, ever talked about it. And as the disease progressed, my drinking stories are really boring, right? But as the disease progressed, of course, the relationship deteriorated. And I was determined that I wasn't going to nuke a second marriage. And I just kept hanging on. And finally, he went sailing around the world without me, right? For most people, that would be a clue that relationship was over. Not for me. Not for me. I just thought, oh, well, that's fine. That actually gave me what I thought was the freedom, the old freedom, right? The old freedom to drink my face off. And I had this idealistic view that, somehow I'd join him in these exotic ports of call, and we would, sail from one place to another. And there were two things about that were kind of off. One was he didn't give me an itinerary. He didn't have a clue where he was. Not a clue. And the second was that the disease had progressed to the point that I wasn't capable of doing any of that stuff. I didn't have the earning capacity anymore. I didn't have the mental capacity anymore. And so, I started this just really horrible alcoholic syndrome, right? And it continued. At one point, my sobriety date's 1994. In 1992, though, for some reason, one day I called Alcoholics Anonymous. I called the Vancouver Central Office hotline, and I don't know why to this day. I don't even know how I knew to do it, but I did. I'd had like the requisite amount of booze in me that day, and it just seemed like a good idea, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, I called, and again, I owe my sobriety to these thousands of people. I owe this new freedom to people I will never, ever meet or know. But, they've been of service to Alcoholics Anonymous. And the guy who answered the phone, his name was Joe. I will never forget his name. And I called and I said, hi, I think I might have maybe, a little problem with alcohol. And he said, you do, that's great. That's wonderful. And I'm like, okay, not the reaction I expected, but still. And he was just so excited because he had a live one. I swear I was his first live one, right? Like, he'd probably come fresh out of the phone workshop, right? Fresh out of it, right? And he said, all right, he said, okay, I know what I have to do. I know what I have to do. I have to find you a woman. That's what I have to do. And I said, okay. And he said, don't go away. And I said, okay. But, he did his job. Two really nice people came over that night and took me to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm so grateful to Joe and that phone committee and that central office and your home group for supporting that central office. Right? And your home group for supporting the amazing communication structure that we have. I am so grateful. That's what gave me that new freedom. I went to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was the East Burnaby group of AA. It met at 9 o'clock at night, which was good for an alcoholic like me because it meant the meeting went till 10, and in those days, the liquor stores weren't open after 10 o'clock. So my chances of picking up alcohol to drink at home were lessened quite substantially. And I told you, like, someone read me the promises at that meeting, and I just went, whoa, that's just so far beyond me. And I saw those steps, and I saw those traditions. I don't think I even saw the traditions. I saw the steps, and I just went, huh? And they made no sense to me. And people kept asking me the same three questions. I turned up at that meeting week after week, but hated it. Right? People would ask me three questions. One, do you have a sponsor? So I asked a woman that I worked with to be my sponsor because part of my job was to keep her on the road. And I knew she couldn't call me, and I was not going to call her. Pre-cell phone days, right? So there was no way we were going to keep in touch. But I could say when you asked me, yes, I have a sponsor, thanks. And then you'd ask me if I had a home group, and I made East Burnaby my home group because I wasn't going to any other meetings. That was easy. And I said, yeah, I signed up, and they said, do you have a home group? I said, yes, I do, thank you. And then the big book. Had I read the big book? Got a big book at my first meeting. Still have that big book. Read it like a novel, hated everything about it, hated the language, hated the ageism, hated the sexism, just hated it. Someone would say, have you read the big book? I goes, yes, I have, thank you, right? Thanks so much, I have. I've read the big book, I have a sponsor, and I have a home group, right? And I was doing nothing in the spirit in which you were giving me. Like you were trying to give me the tools. You were trying to help me through this. I didn't want it. So what I did next, I don't use soft words. I don't use relapse. I don't use slip. I don't use going out. I made a very conscious decision to drink again for as long and as hard as I could. And I am exceedingly grateful that it wasn't all that long, and I hope it's as hard as it had to be. All right, I'm still grateful every morning. I get up, I wake up, and I go, I didn't have to drink today. Yesterday. I'm still sober today. Because I'm just as far as this glass of water. It's as far away as I am from that drink. But, so I chose to drink again. You had taught me enough that I knew it was probably a pretty bad idea. But I far preferred that blackness, right, to the untreated alcoholism, that we heard about last night as well, that untreated alcoholism that made my mind, I was more obsessed with drinking than I ever was when, not drinking, than I ever was when I was drinking. And so I just chose that blackness. I went deep down into that hole. And, when I hit that bottom, and again, my old freedom was I had the freedom to drink my face off. And so I had worked on a project. I had loaded my house up with alcohol. At this point, my drinking pattern was get up in the morning to earn the money to go to work, so I could stop at the liquor store, so I could go home and drink until I passed out. That was a good night. A bad night was when I would, go to work, to earn the money, to stop at the liquor store, to go home to drink, and I would drink everything, and I hadn't passed out yet, because that would mean I would get in my car and I would drive back to the liquor store to get more booze if there was enough change in the couch or something, because I was living pretty close to the bone. And it was an awful, awful pattern. There was nothing social about it. It was all consequence. It was no fun. It was just that cycle of shame and guilt and remorse. And it was horrible. But it was my solution. Alcohol was still my solution. And so, I'd been working on a project, and so I had loaded the house up with more booze because I knew I was going to be busy all weekend, right? Like have the glass of wine and then go home and drink. And I loaded the house up. We had the opening kickoff, and I stayed up all night and drank every drop of booze in the house. And I was still drunk. I don't know if I slept or not. I got in my car. I drove downtown, and I got arrested for drunk driving in the parking lot of the Trade and Convention Center at 9:30 in the morning. It's the very same parking lot that you might get to know in 2025 when the International Convention comes to Vancouver. So, there are full circles going around. But, that was that old freedom of drinking my face off. And, and here I am. So when they're fingerprinting me, right, one of the questions they asked was, are you an alcoholic? And I said, yes. And I finally got step one. Because I had known I was powerless over alcohol forever, but it didn't matter. I just didn't care, right? It was fine. I didn't recognize the unmanageability. I didn't see the emotional mess and the mental obsession as abnormal or, as unmanageable. I just didn't see it. That's what alcohol does to me. Once it's in my system, all bets are off. And so, that was my step one. And then, the most remarkable thing happened, because the arresting officer didn't throw me in the drunk tank. The arresting officer turned me over to victim services. And I've heard one other person say they had that happen to them too. And that means that just like Joe, the guy on the phone, someone somewhere along the line, and a committee of people who have a heart full of service for Alcoholics Anonymous, had done work in public information or in cooperation with the professional community that meant that this police officer knew more about the disease of alcoholism than I did. And what he saw in me was some hope that I didn't see in myself at all. And he's one of the thousands of people who have made it possible for me to be sober today. And he's definitely the first person to give me that hope. Just that little inkling of hope. And so I decided I was going to do things differently. I kind of got, I knew I was done. I surrendered, right? I finally surrendered. And, I got active in AA, right? I went to 1 or 2 meetings a day when I could, right? I looked for a sponsor. I looked really hard for a sponsor. I ended up actually, it felt like about 100 women to be my sponsor, honestly. They all said no. I was like, it was probably 4, right? It was 100. And finally I asked a man who I really trusted if he could help me find a woman sponsor, because I knew I needed a woman sponsor, but I had run out of ideas in terms of women to ask. And he handed me over to my first sponsor, whose method of sponsorship was to throw a bunch of wacky newcomers together and lead us through a big book study, and it was the beginning of my recovery. And I am so grateful to George for introducing me to another Kathy to get me started in the program of recovery that is Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's when my new freedom truly began. And so, I had a sponsor who wasn't just in name only, right? And I was reading the big book in a way I couldn't on my own. right? I can't do this on my own. That's the thing. I need those thousands of people that went before me who have been of service. I need you in the room right now. I need my home group. It needs all of us. All of us need all of us. And so it started to make sense to me, right? And so I understood that now you had been offering me things in a way that I just hadn't been willing to see. You had been offering me amazing things. You had been offering me the same kind of unconditional love that I got from my grandmother when I met her when I was 20. She died a year after I met her, but I got to meet her. That was the important thing. And so it all started to make sense. Now, my parents used to come from Midland to Vancouver every winter, like this time of year, March, to break up the winters, right? Because there was winter back then. And so my mom and dad would come out, and they would stay in the apartment in my house. And my mom came without my dad, because my dad had a rough winter, just a tough time. And so I said to Mom, okay, well, I'll come to Midland at the end of May and see Dad. And I'm going to meetings and I'm doing all the things, and my mother's puzzled, but she's kind of grateful that, I'm not passed out in the living room floor anymore or things like that. And so, we had a nice visit, and she went back home, and I continued. I'm working, I'm doing everything I can. And she called me and she said, Trish, you need to come home now. You can't wait till the end of May. This was the beginning of May. It was the first week in May. And she said, you need to come home now. Your dad's in hospital and we don't know what's going on, so you need to come home now. And because I'd been sober just long enough, because you'd taught me how to stay sober one day at a time, I could do that. I could do the complicated things like, making sure I was okay at work, making sure that I could change the flight. And amazingly enough, I could get on a plane and I could not drink on a plane. I was one of the people who sat in the back row and, smoked. In those days you could smoked, in the smoking section at the back of the plane, and just drank and got shit-faced with all my lower companions. We were such good friends. And there was something about that extra altitude that just, made flying so great, drinking and flying so great. And, but I didn't, because I felt like I had God on one shoulder and my Father on the other. And that was because you had taught me that. And every meeting I went to, because there were a couple of days before I could leave, I asked you to pray for my dad and to pray for me, and you did. And I got to Toronto, and a cousin picked me up and took me to Midland and dropped me at my parents' house, and Mom and I went to the hospital. And my father was not responsive, but I know he knew I was there. And I got to tell him that I love him, and I got to tell him that I would look after my mom. I promised him I would do that. And I know he was waiting for me, and he died 20 minutes after I got there. And I wouldn't have gotten there without you and the thousands of people before you. And the thing is that this new freedom comes at a high, high cost, right? Too many of us have to die. And it was alcoholism that killed my dad. It was determined that actually he'd had undiagnosed pancreatic cancer as a direct result of chronic alcoholism. And it killed him. And I knew that his death was my gift of life. And so I don't take my sobriety lightly. I definitely take it joyfully, but I don't take it lightly because too many of us die, right? That is the end result of this disease. Left to my own devices, I will drink and I will die. And, and the amazing thing about all of that, so there I was. And I had made my mom the enemy, I got to tell you, right? I mean, my father was, he was the Navy guy. He'd left the disciplining to my mom. And so we did not get along particularly well. And I had made this promise. And so my mom actually, my mom moved to Parksville on Vancouver Island. My father had promised her that once he retired from the Ontario Civil Service, they would move back to the West Coast, because my mom had gone to nursing school in Victoria. And, but, he couldn't do it. He couldn't leave his armchair. So, but once he died, boy, Mom had the house sold the next day, and bang, right? She sold it to a neighbor. I know you're not supposed to do that, but she sold it to a neighbor, and she moved to Parksville. And when she moved to Parksville, this self-centered to the core alcoholic, I kind of ignored my mother, and my father and I drank to the exclusion of my mother. And when my mom moved to Parksville, I began to notice that she maybe had a problem with alcohol, and that hadn't even occurred to me, right? And it dawned on me as time went on that was it. But I would go over to Parksville. go to my meetings in Parksville. I had a great AA community there. I had started to get really interested. My home group allowed me to be of service inside the group, and it now was allowing me to be, as I continued on sobriety, it allowed me to be of service outside the group. So I was an intergroup rep. And when Mom was in Parksville, I was a really active general service representative. And so I would get to know people from all around British Columbia and the Yukon at the area assemblies and things. And so I knew a bunch of people in Parksville. And so, it was, I would go to meetings, I would come home, I would pour my mother into bed, and I would just, I'd try and give her to God, but it was, I just kept it secret because that's what you do. And I would talk to my AA friends, but it just hadn't occurred to me, self-centered to the core, that she had a problem. One day, she fell in her little front garden, and she broke her hip. And so when the ambulance came, it was the morning. They detected alcohol on her breath, so they sent her down to Nanaimo General Hospital with a warning ahead, saying, we might have someone who has as they say these days, a substance abuse issue. And so she got to Nanaimo General Hospital, and there was a substance abuse unit. The unit was actually one nurse, but they called it a unit. But that's because, again, our relationship with the medical profession, our relationship with the treatment community, our relationship with with all kinds with the faith community, these are hugely important. All of those relationships with the professional community, because frontline, right? They sometimes get them before we do. We know our job, but it's that cooperation, not affiliation, but that cooperation is so important. So this substance use person was able to tell my mother, I only ever talked to my mother about my drinking. That's what I'd been taught to do. I just tried to be the best big book she could ever see. And this nurse could talk to my mother as a professional, right? A nurse to a nurse, about perhaps her problem with alcohol. Now, I was elated, right? Like the secret was out of the bag. Like I didn't have to worry anymore. So, and this is where Al-Anon literally saved my life. Because I had my mother's sponsor picked for her. I had her meetings picked for her. I knew exactly which ones were good for her, right? I knew it all. And, bless my AA friends, they turned me over to their Al-Anon partners and friends and spouses and said, Trish, you need help. And so I'm always grateful when I'm at a conference or convention where there's participation by Al-Anon family groups. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for allowing me to have a relationship with my mother. I'm so grateful. Anyway, I don't know from this day to then if my mother had another drink. There was a meeting in Nanaimo at the hospital, and she asked me to take her. And so, I was excited. I was taking her home to a meeting. Oh, boy. And grateful, right? Again, because in Nanaimo, that intergroup had put together a meeting in the hospital. The thousands of people who've gone before me, who have been of incredible service in Alcoholics Anonymous. Right? It's a three-sided program, right? It's recovery and it's unity and it's service. Anyway, and she was so interested, and she's a tiny little thing, unlike her daughter, and she was really interested, and she was watching everything, and I was asked to share, and she interrupted me and told them the real story, and at the end of it, I said, "So what did you think, Mom?" I'm wheeling her back up to her room. "What did you think, Mom?" And she said, "Oh, Trish," she said, "that was so interesting." And she said, "I don't need it at all, though. Glad it's there for you." And I went, "Okay." And as I say, I don't know from that day till now if she drank again, and it doesn't matter. I don't think she did. Mom actually moved to Vancouver. She was on a waiting list for a senior's place. After that, she wasn't so comfortable living alone. And at this point, I have had enough recovery. For me, it's really important that I do a yearly set of steps. That's just the way I do it. I'm that kind of alcoholic. In order to get rid of that self-centeredness to any degree, it's really important. And that whole sense of a living amends to my mother and being there for her and being able to be there in a way that I couldn't be was so hugely important. And she actually, there's another person here. There is a boy meets girl in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I honestly wouldn't be standing with you today if it weren't for a wonderful member of Alcoholics named Arnie. And he is not Arnie the Third. I call him Arnie the Only. And when I was delegate and I was traveling a lot, my mother would refer to him as little orphan Arnie. But Arnie and I were living together in the house. And so whether it was out of respect for Arnie and I, because my mom loved Arnie, unlike the other two, she really loved him. And she didn't drink. And then she moved to a senior's place just up the hill, and it was in a high-rise, the only high-rise in the neighborhood, and she could look down and see the house and know if we were home or not. And I would call her every day, and I would do all the things you taught me to do, right? I learned how to be a daughter from you. And it was, I'm so grateful that I was able to do that living amends as well as other amends with her. And, when I was delegate, it was 2007 and 2008 when the earth was cooling. And, because I'd gotten interested in what it was that I belonged to. So from General Service Representative, I became a district committee member, and then I was on what was called General Service Committee, and I was elected as the Area 79 delegate. And we always had Sunday dinner together. I would cook dinner at the house and take it up to Mom, but not on the weekends. I was traveling. And as delegate, you do a lot of reports, and you've got some fabulous past delegates at this conference. And she would sort of wistfully say, "Where are you this weekend?" And I'd say, "Oh, wherever I'm going, Mom." And she said, "Oh, okay." But there was just that wistfulness, like she would have preferred if I could spend more time with her. And I thought, when I'm through with that term as delegate, that'll work. And Mom, in 2008, that my term as delegate was going to end on December 31st, 2008, at midnight. And my mom passed away on December 31st, 2008, at 10 o'clock. And again, I was the best daughter I could be. And I couldn't have done any of that without you. But I have to say, I got a little unmoored, right? I hadn't realized the impact and the extent of just all of that, of loss, right, of grief. I thought I had, but, I'm a good alcoholic again. But, I am just so grateful that I had any opportunity to be able to be of service to my mother, because it's not just in the rooms, and it's how we are in the world. It's how we walk in the world. It's how I treat the cashier in the lineup. It's all of that, right? But to actually have relationships, because I really believe that, the steps are all about restoring and reframing and just totally redoing relationships. That's what they're all about. So, it was just so extraordinary to do that. And, Arnie and I, we've had an extraordinary life together. In 2000, I can never remember if it's 17 or 18. I think it's 18 though. We did the senior citizen thing. I retired from work at age 60. I'm 69 now. And we did the senior citizen thing, and we threw the dogs in a travel trailer and got a truck, and we went from the west coast of Canada to the east coast of Canada and back again, all in Canada, right? And stopping to see family and friends along the way and going to meetings all the way along the way. And I have to tell you that, the slender thread that holds us together as Alcoholics Anonymous, it is a slender thread. It's incredibly precious. We don't know what we have. We especially don't know what we have when we're in urban areas where we're really well served, where we have central offices and service committees and, lots of people and lots of meetings. You don't like someone, you just go to another meeting. Not true in other places. And it's just so precious. It's so fragile, right? And the thing about it is that it's so I got to witness that in that trip across Canada. But then, I've always just put my hand up for Alcoholics Anonymous, right? That's all I do. I'm just a drunk trying to stay sober one day at a time. That's it. That's all. And my watch just cacked out on me. Of course it did. It actually sent an alarm to my husband the night before last, because I don't know what I was doing in my sleep, but it decided I had fallen out of bed, I think. It was like, oh, he's in Vancouver. I'm in Toronto. That just was anyway. I've always just put up my hand, and sometimes it's been, yeah, Trish, your hand is wanted now, and sometimes it's been, nope, not right now, Trish. So, it got a little scarred, but it's always been just put up your hand. And so I kept putting up my hand, and in 2019 I was elected as the trustee at large for Canada. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it, right? I talked about a triangle with Recovery Unity Service. We all have a structural triangle. We are not governed. This is not an organization that has any central government. What we do have is a really complex communication structure. And the groups are at the very top of it, and then there's some stuff at the bottom. And so I drifted my way to the bottom of the triangle. And I served on the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous as the trustee at large for Canada for 4 years. Now, that was 2019 to 2023. So, of course, in the center of that was COVID. And, that meant that the trustees at large, there's one for the U.S. and one for Canada, have the incredible privilege and responsibility of when other countries ask for attendance at some events, like celebratory events, like, a convention that's, got a 0 or a 5 attached to it, perhaps, or going to one of their general service conferences, because, thank you, the fact is that, we have a U.S.-Canada service structure, but around the world they are independent, right? We act as a repository. But the U.S. and Canada trustees at large get to attend those events on your behalf, right? What an incredible privilege. It was absolutely extra. And that freedom, that new freedom, was just amazing. So I want to take like my very first 12-step call and my most remarkable 12-step call and put them together for you as I wrap it up. And I talked way too. I can talk about the international stuff for another hour, but I won't, unless you want to have coffee with me. Then I will. But before COVID shut everything down, and I do want to say that it was extraordinary to be the trustee at large and witness the world open up again from a structural perspective. I figured everybody was a trustee at large during COVID. Everybody could go anywhere all the time for a meeting, right? I was a trustee at small, but the privilege to watch what was going on structurally from that beautiful perspective again of the thousands of people keeping the lights on in other countries was amazing. Just to see people do conference, make sure that the lights were on in their country by just adopting to this particular technology. But anyway, so my very first 12-step call, I wasn't that sober. I went with another group member, and it was to a little basement apartment in East Vancouver. And we went, and the woman who answered the door obviously had cognitive decline. She didn't have a drinking issue. She had a cognitive issue. But she had called Alcoholics Anonymous because her husband had been a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and she knew if you called Alcoholics Anonymous, they would come. So, we called her building superintendent, and he called her son, and we made her a pot of tea and did all that stuff. But if you call Alcoholics Anonymous, we will come. And when I was your trustee at large, one of the places I got to go was Bolivia. It was one of the last places, international places I got to go. And the fellowship in Bolivia is small. It's about 3,000 people, right? And they were going through civil unrest. Like they were having a convention. They almost canceled it. There were roadblocks. There was civil disruption. It was kind of messy. They almost canceled. We almost didn't go, but we went. And when we went to their general service office general manager is a gentleman named Chiqui. And Chiqui came to the door. It was in a little apartment building in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. And he came to the door and he had tears in his eyes. And he just said, "You came." Just like Mrs. J. When Alcoholics Anonymous calls, we come, right? And so, when you think about that extraordinary gift and responsibility, and I got to go to Bolivia, I got to go to Brazil, I got to go to Portugal, all service entities and service functions. I got to witness all this stuff on Zoom. I attended 2 World Service meetings on Zoom. At the last World Service meeting, Russia and Ukraine were at war, and they were both in the room. There are no borders in Alcoholics Anonymous. Right? But when Chiqui from Bolivia said you came, it just brought it all home to me, right? And it was incredibly moving. It still is. And the lengths that people go to keep the lights on in their country with very little, very, very little. Traveling for days to get to this convention in Bolivia. And, women in Alcoholics Anonymous, in service in Alcoholics Anonymous. That's a whole nother deal. I've been able, just because I've been able to stay sober one day at a time, and I've had this new freedom, you have given me this incredible gift of a life I just don't know. It was beyond anything I could have imagined because I didn't have that imagination. I couldn't when I was drinking. But, I just think of Chiqui in Bolivia when you get that next 12-step call. Because in Alcoholics Anonymous, we come. Thank you so much for inviting me to come.
That was incredible. Oh my
Thanks.
goodness.